Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Art Side of Life, where it's all about how you can turn your creative passion into a profession. My name is Eva, and my guest today is a freelance illustrator, concept artist, author, and teacher living now in Florida, United States. He has worked in entertainment industry for nearly 15 years, and the bulk of his career has been spent as a video game concept artist, working on such titles as Dungeons and Dragons Online and The Lord of the Rings Online. His freelance client list include, among many others, Legendary Pictures, Guillermo del Toro, Wizard of the Coast, Lego, EA Games, and ImagineFX magazine. His work has been chosen for past 7 Spectrum annuals, and he has been featured in ImagineFX magazine too, Kotaku.com, Expose, and Prime. He is now teaching at Ringling College of Art in Florida, and he also occasionally runs his own 6 weeks long intensive online seminars on the subject of world building for concept artists and illustrators. The production of his illustrated fantasy book Getaway, the Book of Wizards, was funded by a successful 2012 Kickstarter campaign, and the book was primer for a fantasy world centered on a vast city called Getaway, which he has been working on in his sketchbooks for over 15 years. Recently, with his friends, he has also produced a board game, Getaway Uprising, so check it out. So please welcome Sean Marie, and let's get to the interview. But before we do that, on the side note, there was a technical glitch caused that my video was not recorded for most of the time of the interview. That's why there is only a static image of myself. But you will go see Sean. So let's get to the interview. Welcome everyone to the next episode of Art Side of Life, and I'm super happy to have my guest here. Sean, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Great, and I'm really happy that you are here because you have so much experience in the artistic area, and I'm really happy that you will share some insights and maybe some tips. And let's start with your background, and if you can share what was your creative outlet as a child?
Oh, well, I came from a family of athletes. I had lots of brothers and sisters, and almost all of them were very athletic. I was not. My father would take me out into the backyard and throw the baseball around with me, and I would sort of duck, it was pretty clear early on, that I had some different ideas. So I would kind of basically sequester myself in my room and draw a lot. Not because, I didn't want to hang out with my family. I love my family, but I was the only one really that had that the artistic inclination at the time. And my father tells me that my first drawing was on the underside of the dining room table with a box of crayons, and we had that table for a long time. And I think he said I was like barely 3 years old. So, I read a lot of comic strips and watched a lot of cartoons, and, Star Wars and Transformers and things like that as a child were hugely influential on me. I used to carry around a clipboard in elementary school with stacks of paper, and I would draw my own comics, comic characters, robots, things like that. So that kind of idea where I always had a place to go for myself, mentally and my imagination, basically just meant that I always had either a stack of paper or a sketchbook with me wherever I went, and that remains true to this day. In high school, I met up and hung out with some other like-minded individuals. We were all kind of into art and role-playing games, so I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and Warhammer and stuff through junior high and high school. We used to make up our own video games and draw them out on graph paper.
Wow, cool.
And actually, a few of my friends from that time period, first of all, I'm still friends with a lot of those guys from my hometown. But many of them went into video games as a career, including myself. Mm-hmm. I think I was thinking about this the other day. I think my family always sort of regarded me as kind of the odd one, in the family. Not, they didn't make me feel unwelcome, but I certainly was. I was sort of like a fascination to them, like where did this one come from,
That one do the games and drawings,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So you know, but I always had their support, which I think is really the key, right? Maybe they didn't understand everything that I was into, but they were always supportive of me and interested in hearing what was going on in my life. And that carried through to college as well. Both of my parents supported me in majoring in art. The one thing though that I sort of did as sort of a hedging a bit on that was that I went to Syracuse University, which had a great illustration program, has a great illustration and art program, but it's also a full university. So, if the whole art thing didn't work out, I could, there were perhaps some other options that I could explore if I needed to. But thankfully, I found my calling while I was there. I studied illustration, but realized that what I wanted to do and what my passion was eventually going to be was concept art. I have to thank one of my illustration professors for preventing me from going down perhaps the wrong path. Initially, I had gone to Syracuse to study computer graphics. Mm-hmm. And at the time, in the early 90s, a computer graphics program was very programming heavy. Mm-hmm. It was still in its infancy in terms of user friendliness, I guess you could say. So, at Syracuse, you had to go through foundation courses in your first year, drawing, painting, 2D and 3D and all that stuff. Art history. And one of the illustration professors noticed how much I liked to draw, and he asked me what I was going to major in, and I told him computer graphics, and he said, well, do you like programming too? And I said, no, not particularly. So he encouraged me to major in illustration instead, and I'm glad I did that, because then I could just teach myself the digital stuff, on my own. And again, it was still growing at the time, so that's my, I studied illustration, and then after college, I tried my hand at a lot of different things. I tried comic books, I tried web design, animation, web game design. That was one of my first real jobs, was in New York City designing web games for Cartoon Network. And actually, I did. We were talking earlier that you used to work for Lego. I actually did work on a couple of Lego web games, and I did some Lego magazine illustrations back in the day. So, and then that was all in New York City. Eventually, after that, got out of New York and went to Boston and got my first job as a concept artist for a video game, working on Lord of the Rings Online and Dungeons and Dragons Online. So, that's sort of the where it all came from. I mean, I don't want to, if you got other questions about where I went through with my career, but that was sort of my inroad into world building, which is my passion. Yeah.
But as you mentioned that right after college you went to Cartoon Network, and how did you get there? I mean, it's like, oh yeah, I went there, but did you send emails, or did they discover you through college? Or...
Well, so actually, I didn't work for Cartoon Network. I worked for a company called Funny Garbage, and they were contracted to do all of the web games for Cartoon Network. Cartoon Network was their major client. Now, we worked directly with people at Cartoon Network, but Funny Garbage was a separate company. They were actually a company that was started by some fairly well-known New York graffiti artists, and they partnered with a music label, a small music label, and created a web design company. And so Cartoon Network was their main client, and so we had the contract to basically do all of their web games. So it was kind of like a back road into that. And the way I got that job was I had a friend that was working for them as a sound designer. And I was working at an ad agency at the time, designing movie ads for newspapers. It was a pretty dull job. But I was always drawing at night. I was doing my own sort of freelance stuff for role-playing games and like Dungeons and Dragons and White Wolf games and Steve Jackson games, and so I was doing that stuff on the side. But it wasn't where it wasn't at the point where I could make a career out of it at that point. You don't get paid a lot to do those black and white illustrations on the inside of the books. But actually that job doing the games for Cartoon Network gave me my first taste of designing, of doing concept design, because there was this larger project that we had to design this very interactive game. It was a 4 or 5 part game that coincided with content that was being shown on Cartoon Network. Mm-hmm. It was called Toonami Lockdown, and it was we designed our own top-down robot-based RPG. So it was sort of like old school Final Fantasy, like Nintendo Final Fantasy style game. And I got to design all of the robots, all of the enemy robots for that. They had a design for the good guy that you controlled, but I was responsible for designing all of the enemy robots. And that was where I really got hooked on the idea of designing something from scratch instead of creating artwork based on other people's characters or other content that had already been created.
Yeah. And because when you mentioned that you liked robots as well before, and now this was like also really your passion. So if someone would want to do like what you do now, and they're like fans of Dungeons and Dragons and Lord of the Rings, what would you advise them to do? Like start creating their stories, or just started to sketch something simple, or just...
so I talk a lot about this at workshops that I do and when I teach as well. First you have to decide, do you want to work for, do you want to actually create content for something like Dungeons and Dragons or Lord of the Rings? Well, in that case, that's a different pathway than if you want to create your own worlds. If your passion is to illustrate Dungeons and Dragons or work for Magic, then the advice is, well, look at what they're doing and create a portfolio that sort of hits a lot of those keys, or hits a lot of those notes that you see, so that an art director can look at their portfolio and go, yeah, I can see how your work would apply to what we're doing. If you want to create your own content, if you're a fan of that kind of stuff, but you want to create your own content, it's a trickier road. But my advice is always just to start small, start somewhere. For me, it was in my sketchbook. It was drawing, characters and scenes in this world that I knew was in my head, but I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know where I was going with it yet. But after 10 years of just drawing these things in my sketchbook, eventually I started to sort of hone in on what exactly it was. Mm-hmm. But you have to kind of live with it for a little while. And one of my pieces of advice about world building is always don't force your world into existence. Let it evolve. Mm-hmm. And so starting with a small project, just designing, a few characters and a spaceship that they ride around in, or a small village with a castle at the top, and what's the story of the characters that live there. Those are the kinds of things that they can build and grow, or just draw a map, and put a bunch of dots on it, and then you'd be amazed at how just drawing a map, kind of gets you thinking about, okay, well, what's this village's story? Why, they're close to this mountain pass, and okay, so maybe there's a big marketplace there, or a big trading post, So, it's those kinds of things that sort of get you thinking. I think it's wrong to think that you have to sort of sit down and think really hard and hope that it's all just going to pop right out of your head, Right, exactly. But it doesn't happen that way. You have to, I could go on and on and on about this, but, you have to start somewhere. You have to start small. and just allow things to progress naturally, you know.
Yeah, and when you started to create your characters, did you already like think about, okay, they will be part of this world, or it kind of just happened?
No, not at all. I mean, you know, there was just what I realized was there was a certain aesthetic and a certain um, idea that I seemed to be revisiting a lot, or that I was trying to find something that I wasn't seeing anywhere else, right? That there and part of it was that you know, as I said, I grew up on Star Wars. You know, I loved science fiction as a kid, but I also really loved Lord of the Rings and fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the things I never thought was fair was that fantasy worlds always seem to have the same kind of monsters and creatures and beings in them. You know, they all had elves and dwarves and dragons and you know, a lot of similar kinds of things. And whereas science fiction worlds, it felt like the sky was the limit. Like you could have all kinds of weird and interesting creatures and beings. You know, the cantina scene in the original Star Wars film was like, you know, wow. And I mean, you know, yeah, in a universe where you can fly to hundreds of different planets, of course, there would just be this multitude of variety of creatures and characters, and it would be a diverse melting pot. And I wanted to see a fantasy world that did the same thing. So that was always kind of in the back of my mind, and one of the goals I wanted to achieve with whatever I was creating. So in my sketchbooks, I was always drawing these characters that existed in a fantasy world where magic was the sort of key element, right? But that was the only thing that made it a fantasy world. Otherwise, it was, you know, I was just inventing completely new and unique characters and creatures. I love the idea of wizards, you know, and so, but you know, it's like, but a wizard can be anything. If magic can be anything, then so can a wizard. They can, you know, there's, you know, all kinds of things, the ways that can manifest itself. And so I just used the world around me, like the city. I lived in New York City for a long time, and that became a huge inspiration for my own property, for Gateway. Yeah, so it just kind of snowballed from there.
And how did you keep the balance of realism and kind of relatable characters, you know, when it still needs to be part of recognizable thing, right, in the creature, because you cannot go too ballistic?
Right. Well, you know, I think for that you have to think about when you go into any of our own cities, there is you know, cities are places of diversity, right? And they're melting pots. There are these, but what else is true is that there are just so many interesting stories around every corner. You know, when I lived in New York, I you know, turn a corner and suddenly there was like you know, a cultural festival there, you know, that I didn't know was there. Or one day I walked out of a coffee shop and, you know, 500 motorcycles went by out in the street, you know, and each person riding a motorcycle was just a completely different character. And, you know, and it's like, well, what, you know, where did these guys come from and where are they going, you know? And so I think you have to think about real stories in our own world, and that in a made up world, in a fantasy world, that if you can get that sense that people are dealing with similar issues, or have similar goals or ideas in mind, then that's what makes the stories relatable. The characters become relatable because their stories resonate with our own stories, right? You know, a really good example of this was, I thought, was the Battlestar Galactica series, the newer one that came out, you know, I think it ended about 5 years ago or so. But I remember thinking how brilliantly they weaved in stories that are relatable to our own lives. You know, a character, you know, comes down with cancer, and, you know, or another character, you know, is dealing with alcoholism, you and so it's those kind, but yet it's all in the context of these people who are on these spaceships flying through outer space, and dealing with these robots that can disguise themselves as humans, and it's like, well, that part, I can't relate to, although, in some ways you could say psychologically, maybe we deal with people, you deal with people all the time and you're not sure, you think they're one thing and they turn out to be another. So, so that in that way that can relate. So I think that's what you have to do is you have to make the stories that you're telling about your characters resonate with the human experience.
Yeah, definitely. And so do you have also some, I don't know, favorite tools, what you work with now, or maybe what you started with? Like, oh, I have this favorite pencil or digitally.
Yeah. Yes, I do, and it's right here. This is my favorite pencil. It's a Draftmatic, an Alvin Draftmatic 0.3 millimeter mechanical pencil. It's the only thing I use to draw. I mean, occasionally I'll pull out a Micron pen if I'm going to do inking, or I'll do a nib pen with ink. But for pencil sketching, this is pretty much all I use. I don't necessarily recommend it for somebody that's starting out. Using a variety of pencils is always a good way to start drawing. And then you can find out what works best for you. And I also use a mechanical eraser. This is actually not the smallest one I have. I have another one that's even smaller width, made by, I'm going to blank on it.
The Japanese brand?
Yes.
The Mono eraser, I think.
Yeah, Mono.
Called.
Yeah, Mono. Yeah. Mono Zero.
Yes.
So those are my two main tools. I draw on Bristol board or on it's called layout bond, but it's sort of similar like marker paper. Occasionally I work on watercolor paper or watercolor board. And then I use the Cintiq as well when I'm doing digital color. Sometimes I'll start a sketch digitally, like a rough sketch, then I'll print it out very lightly onto Bristol board. And then, so it's almost like a ghosted image, and then I can do a tighter pencil drawing over top of it like that. Yeah. That's one of my favorite methods. It's a good time-saving method. It's not great if what you're looking to have is like, a sellable piece of, original artwork, because you will end up still seeing a bit of that ghosted, and you can't erase it, but usually it's light enough and you can't tell. But I use that method for, when I'm doing concept work or client work. I don't always use that method if I'm doing a personal piece, something that I'm thinking might go in a frame, So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it can also look more artsy when you have these lines there, so more creative. Sure. So people who are not in art, they can consider it even more interesting.
Yeah.
And do you work in your studio, which is in your house, or do you have to travel to the studio, or how do you organize your day? Like, how many hours a day do you work on art and teaching and everything?
Well, yeah, there is no formula for me. Unfortunately, it's very chaotic. Right now I'm in a sort of a temporary apartment that I have in Florida, which is where I'm teaching at Ringling College of Art and Design in Sarasota, Florida. It's temporary because eventually my family is going to move down here. They've stayed in New York for this coming year, which is where I was living until I moved down here to teach. My wife wanted to continue working with her organization for at least another year, and my son was already enrolled in his school. So we decided they were going to continue to do a year there. That way I can sort of do some reconnaissance down here and figure out exactly where we want to live and all that stuff. I tend to like a studio that is in my house or right next to my house because I have odd working hours, and it's I'm not very consistent about it. Sometimes I work late at night, and other times I'm dead tired at 11 p.m. Maybe that's a product of getting older. I don't know. I used to be a night owl and stay up till 3 a.m. every night, but it's not as possible these days. As I'm getting a little bit older here, but and now with the teaching schedule, I have, there's 4 days out of the week where I have either 1 or 2 classes. I teach 3 classes total, but they're divided up into 2 sections. I usually get some time, either in the beginning or the end of the day to work on either freelance or personal work. Wednesdays are generally free these days for me, but it's going to change every semester. I work on the weekends too, especially that I'm trying to utilize the time I have here by myself. If I was at home, I would want to spend the weekends with my family, obviously. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens when you're freelancing, and this plays into why, one of the reasons why I decided I wanted to teach, is that, I found that there were times in which I was juggling 4 or 5 or 6 client jobs at a time, which often meant that I would have to work on the weekends, and I wouldn't have as much time with my family. And I think I reached a point where that was just unacceptable to me. And it was also taking away time from working on my personal projects on Gateway. So my new goal for the coming year, is to ramp down a lot of my freelance client work. At the most only have 1 client going at a time, which is actually what I've successfully done right now. I'm wrapping up 1 client a job now, and I'm going to move on to another one for October. That way I'm not juggling my time between so many different clients. And then that also gives me the mental freedom to be able to block out the time for the client work and then block out time for my personal projects, which I think is really important. And that was what it was losing time with my family, but also losing time for my personal projects that it just became, not a workable solution. And that's one of the tricky things about being a freelancer, is how do you balance your time? And also being honest with yourself about the types of projects and the types of clients that you want to work for. It's really hard to say no to a job, especially if the money is good, and especially if you're not sure what's coming down the pike. But as a freelancer, you also have to balance that concern with the concern about getting yourself wrapped up into a project that may really bog you down. It's a real balancing act, and it's something that I think every freelancer struggles with, and some get really good at it. I'm getting better at it. I spent most of my career as a full-time concept artist, working in an office, in a studio. So I didn't really have to contend with that. It's only been in the last 3 years or so since I've gone independent that I've had to learn that skill. Yeah, that's vitally important, I think.
And the transition as well from the studios to like your own time management and the project management and everything, learning about business, it's a big change.
Exactly. Yeah.
What would you say was something you wish you knew before you started the whole art career?
I wish I knew what my real value was as an artist, as a concept artist. It's taken a long time before I finally realized that, or it took a long time rather to realize how much of a disservice you do to yourself by doing work for less money than it's worth. And the thing is, I think as artists, we tend to be apologetic about what we charge and or what we're asking for. And we tend to be nervous about somebody saying no, or that's too much, or, I think that is really a dangerous and destructive attitude to have, because what ends up happening is that you end up spending so much of your time for especially as a freelancer, because here's the thing: when you're working for a studio, there are so many expenses that are covered by the studio, and that you don't even realize. I mean, health insurance and taxes and health employment taxes and all these things. So, and every place is different, obviously, but you have to, you also are billing in for time where you may not have work coming in. You have to realize that it's not going to be constant. You're going to have moments where there isn't work coming in. So, if you haven't planned for that, if you haven't built up, funds to sort of get you through those periods, then you're going to find yourself in a bad situation. You may find yourself saying yes to work that you shouldn't be saying yes to, and so I wish I'd known that. I also wish I had known about the idea that billing a client or on an hourly basis is a really tricky game, and that it's better to think of your work, think of billing things by project and by like per image or per project versus on an hourly basis. Because when you say, I'll just keep my hours and bill you on how many hours I work, it basically means it's sort of incentivizing you taking longer to do something. But the client doesn't want it to take longer, right? So they want to take less time. So I think it's really more about, if they could get the same results or better results in less time, for the same amount of money, they'll take it, right? There's this whole great TED talk about this, and that, you're basically, when you bill by the hour, you're basically saying, well, I'm gonna drag this out, I'm gonna try to drag this out so that I actually get paid, the right amount. But what if you hit upon the solution right away, And then it's like, and then, you're not getting paid what really the value is to the client, right?
Yeah.
So these are things, and I think the part of the problem is, as artists are naturally introverts, and we don't want confrontation generally. We fear it, and we want people to be happy with us. We want people to be happy with the work, and we want people to come back to us and ask us to do more work. And so there's this inherent fear of negotiating, of being tough and looking out for yourself and your own self-worth. Like that somehow is antithesis to a lot of what we desire as artists, which is acceptance, right? We want to feel like we are valued and accepted. And so.
Yeah. And also, as you mentioned, like how many hours actually does it take you to create artwork? Also, when you are more skilled, then it takes you shorter, right? And
exactly.
So why would you ask for less money? And but how would you approach it if you are not sure how much you should ask? Would you ask the company okay, what is your budget? And then okay, this would be my proposal, because usually they ask you okay, how much do you ask for?
Right. They all oftentimes the client will ask you first, and the best response to that is to sort of put the ball back in their court and ask them what their budget is. And a lot of times that will tell you a lot, because if they say, well, we only have a few $100s for this, and then you say, well, look, maybe this isn't worth us going any further than this. For a few $100s, you could get, one sketch, or whatever, or a couple sketches. And then they may say, oh, well, that's all we need, or they may say, oh, yeah, never mind. So yeah, it's always helpful to put the ball back in their court. But I would also say that if they push back again, then you just say, well, look, you have to think about for yourself, what is your time worth? In other words, if this is a client that's going to take up a lot of your time, and it's going to take time away from you working on your own personal projects, what is that worth to you? What amount of money would make you feel okay about taking yourself away from from something that you're working on personally, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and the chances are that that number is a lot higher than what you think the client wants to hear, right? And you'll be surprised how often maybe a client will say, "Oh, that's fine," and then the whole time you're thinking like, "Oh my gosh, you know, they're going to think I'm crazy, right?" You know, and here's the other thing: everything is negotiable, right?
Yeah.
If you say, you know, something that seems really ridiculous to you, and they come back and go, "Well, you know, it's a little bit more than we were thinking of paying," and then you say, "Well, okay, you know, where can we meet? You know, is there somewhere in between that we can meet?" And these are just common. See, this is the thing. These are just common negotiating tactics that everyone else in a business-focused career understands and knows intuitively. Yeah, but yet is like pulling teeth sometimes as artists. I was lucky to have a mother who was a business person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she helped me negotiate things in the past, and you know, because for her it was just business, you know, and for artists it's personal, right? So you know, it's all personal, and that makes it that much more difficult, I think.
Yeah, yeah, because then you have this internal discussion like, am I worth this or not? And yeah, but
Exactly. Chances are you're worth a lot more than you think you are, you know. I mean, think about this. Artists have a very specialized skill, especially, you know, I mean, given like think about how much lawyers and doctors, you know, well, doctors, you know, that is pretty specialized skill. But there are lots of lawyers and doctors out there, and there are lots of, you know, accountants, you know, and you know, they demand, a lot of them demand top dollar. Artists' skills are even more specialized in some cases than some of those careers. And yet, you know, somehow we feel like that's worth less, you know. Think of it this way: when a business or a company is using your artwork to promote a product, they're making a lot more money off of it than you are, and they can reuse it oftentimes, depending on how the contracts are written.
mm-hmm.
You know, that's another thing: just understanding contracts, like getting used to, you know, looking at a contract and reading through it and pushing back on things. I've done it, you know, and it's hard sometimes, but I've pushed back on things that, you know, I'm not really comfortable with this whole section that you have in this contract that says, you know, essentially that I won't ever say anything bad about the company, you know, you know, it's like there are things like that in contracts that like
Okay.
I will agree never to say anything negative about the company or anybody that works for the company. And it's like, well, what if somebody that works at a company runs over my dog? You know,
Yeah.
like I'm sorry, but I feel like I retain the right to say something negative about somebody that you know drives, you know, that was maybe drunk and drives over my dog. You know, like, you know, so I'm saying like these are things. You know, we just too quickly sign these contracts and think, well, especially when the client says to you, oh, all this is non-negotiable. Our contracts are non-negotiable. That is the single most untrue statement that anyone ever utters, because everything is negotiable. And if it's non-negotiable for them, then you know, then obviously they don't want to work with you, right? If they really want to work with you, it's negotiable. Trust me.
Yeah, yeah, and also, as you said, like how much it will be used, because if it is used only on one product, if they reuse it on other products, they have more, you know, income later on. So read
Absolutely.
the whole
Yeah.
contract, where it will be used, how much, and yeah, what can
Right.
you get, percentage maybe, or whatever.
I have a good friend. His name's Pete Moorbacher, and he does his website's angelarium.com, and he's one of the guys that I do this art entrepreneurship workshop with, called One Fantastic Week.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how, you know, when he was doing art for Magic, you know, he gets paid once to do a painting for Magic. He might get paid additionally if he can sell some prints at a convention. They do allow you to do that. But now when he does his own personal artwork, which he sells online, he gets paid multiple times for that one piece. For the same amount of time that he's put into a piece of artwork, he sells prints. He then does a Kickstarter where he sells a book that has the artwork in it. He then has a Patreon where people are paying to see the artwork early and see the process. And so it's sort of like you get multiple, he gets multiple revenue streams from one image and gets paid way more money, than he did when he was doing one illustration for Magic Card, and you get paid once, So you have to think about it that way, as well.
Yeah, how to work on your art projects, or how you can create actually passive income for yourself as well. So yeah. And what about your projects right now? Can you tell us a bit more about Gateway, and what are maybe some other upcoming projects you want to share, which are not confidential, maybe?
All right. So in terms of projects that I have going on right now, on September 29th or 30th, thereabouts, my board/card game is going to release, and it's called Gateway Uprising, which I happen to have a copy of right here.
Ooh, nice.
This is being published by a company called CMON, formerly known as Cool Mini or Not Games, but we partnered with them. I have a little game company with my two business partners, John Hawkins and Michelle Menard, who were the designers on the game. We call ourselves Fish Wizard Games. So that's our little logo there. But this is coming out. It'll be available online and at stores around the U.S. Eventually, it will be available in Europe as well. There are several countries that are being targeted for this game, and it's basically based on the world that I created, Gateway, which I myself published a book called Gateway: The Book of Wizards, which came out in 2014. And that was a result of a Kickstarter that I did. We did start a Kickstarter for this project, but then eventually realized that the gaming side of things on Kickstarter is highly competitive, and we weren't prepared for how much promotion we needed to do at a time. So I actually canceled the Kickstarter with the intent of restarting it once we really had our ducks in a row. But in the meantime, I had a pre-printed copy of the game, a demo copy of the game that I had with me at San Diego Comic-Con, and the creative director from Cool Mini came to my table and saw it and expressed some interest, and so it sort of snowballed from there. It took a while, but it's got almost 400 cards in it, and I did all of the artwork. I did most of the design work. In concert with Cool Mini designers and with a designer named Lorraine Flegel, and that graphic design part of it. And John and Michelle did all the game design, and we did a lot of play testing and refining, and it's a really fun game. You get to essentially play as a band of rebellious wizards who are trying to take back the city of Gateway one section at a time. From the evil city guard, but at the same time there are these monsters that are attacking the city, and so you're having to kind of constantly hold your territory from multiple factions. So that's the most recent project. There are several projects that I have in mind as the next one, and each one is at various stages in terms of the sort of pre-production. There's a book, another book that I want to do for Gateway, which is essentially going to be like a travel log, like a Fodor's travel guide, essentially for Gateway. And it's going to focus a lot more on the environments and on the everyday life in Gateway, and not as much on the Book of Wizards was about certain characters who were part of a revolution in the city of Gateway. This is going to focus more on the daily life, but at the same time, told from the viewpoint of a person who's traveling through the city of Gateway and observing some interesting changes and events that are going on in the city that are foreshadowing things to come. Okay, so that's one project. The designers I worked on the card game with, we've been brainstorming an idea for a pen and paper RPG. So that's another potential project. And there are a couple other things that we've been talking about. There's, I eventually would like to do a graphic novel. I have, I've been working with a writer friend of mine who's just an amazing writer Andrew Ozian. He and I have been working on a film script, which could manifest itself in a lot of different ways. It could become a graphic novel. It could become a pitch for a movie. Who knows? But I mean, for me, this Gateway is my passion, and because I've been doing so much freelance client work this past year, I haven't had as much time to put into these projects, but I'm making some changes now so that I can redevote myself to getting further down the path with some of these projects, because it's just it kills me that when I don't get to spend time on Gateway as much, and so and I'm getting older, so the amount of time I have to do that is running out. Right?
Yeah, you have to be faster, with producing
Exactly.
stuff.
Exactly. So,
do you have a favorite character from that universe?
I mean, yes. It's there's this guy. He shows up. He's in the book. He's in the game as well, and I think he will end up being sort of an iconic character. His name is Cardinal Birnbauer, and he's a half man, half fish. And they're called the Saloran in Gateway. But he was a former priest of this church, and when things went badly and his church got destroyed, he picked up a gun and decided to become a freedom fighter on the side of the revolution, and left his religion behind. He's one of the first characters that really I designed for this world, and it was actually part of a contest that at the time called Dominance War, and it was a piece I did for that contest, and I realized that he was sort of one of the first characters that sort of set the stage for me creating the Book of Wizards, because I wanted to know more. When I created him, I wanted to know more about him and the universe that he was in, and I realized that he lived in the same universe I had been drawing in my sketchbook for years and years. Yeah. So yeah, that was really he was the germination, I think, for everything that the Gateway has become at this point.
That makes sense, definitely. And with so many projects you worked on so far, did you have the worst career moment or kind of the difficult time? And if you can share that, then what was maybe the key takeaway or learning from that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I was doing the Kickstarter for the book, for the Book of Wizards, it was actually at the same time that the company I was working for at the time as a concept artist was completely failing, was crumbling. And so it was a real mixed emotions time in my life, right? Because, this career that I had built as a concept artist, as a full-time concept artist, I was realizing how unstable it really was, despite that the illusion of stability. Working for a company, getting a regular paycheck and all that stuff. That seemed like this, well, how can this go wrong? I'm getting paid well, I got great benefits and all that stuff. But when I realized how unstable a market like the video game industry can be, it made me realize that it's no more or less risky than if I was just doing my own thing, And I think it's no coincidence. I mean, it is a coincidence, but it was interesting that was happening at the same time that my Kickstarter for this book was doing so well, and I was getting really great feedback on a personal project of mine that I didn't know if people wanted, at all, or had any interest in. The really tough part came when I realized how long it was taking me to get the book done, and how I had promised, that it would be done within a year, but it was taking 2, almost 3 years to actually get it done. And I had a lot of sleepless nights because I was worried that everybody out there who had pledged to my Kickstarter, that they were going to come to my house with torches and burn my house down and demand their money back,
Yeah.
What I realized was that if I just communicate with people,
Mm-hmm.
and let them know that I'm working on it and that, I haven't, given up the ghost, that's really all that people want to hear. Or, that they just want to know that you're still working on it and that it's still something that you're thinking about and that you are thinking about them, right? There's still a few things that are left to do with that. There are still some people who, I owe some original artwork to, and, I try to communicate with them as much as possible. I'm getting ready to start another Kickstarter, I'm realizing it's going to be tough because, and this is just going to be a Kickstarter just to promote or to self-publish my next collection of sketches for my sketchbooks. But Kickstarters are hard to run and they require a lot of attention, no matter how simple the Kickstarter is. And I'm going to be balancing that with a lot of things. So, I mean, the hardest time, I don't know, I guess it's when it's that time before you finally get the thing out, because you feel like it's going way too long. Same with the board game. We had this idea that it would be out in the first quarter of 2017. But things, especially when you're working with a publisher, they've got a lot of products that they're putting out as well. And, they've got lots of things on their schedule. And so things get pushed back and, people are asking, oh, when's it coming out? When's it coming out? So yeah, I mean, I think that's, there's always times where it's difficult, I guess, and you have to balance that with a day where you get an email from somebody that tells you how much they love your work and how inspiring it's been. And, that makes it all better, I guess,
Yeah, and when you mentioned as well, like the books and going a bit back to what you are also teaching, do you have some books you would recommend for people to check out, like for either inspiration or learning purposes? Of course, your book, first of all, and then something on the side as well.
I love any of the books that Wayne Barlow has put out, Expedition, his Inferno books. James Gurney's Dinotopia books are really inspiring. He's an amazing world builder. There is a book that just came out, and I have it over there, but it's Simon Stolenhag's book. Hold on one second, I'm going to grab it and show it to you. It's Simon Stolenhag's Things from the Flood. I just picked this up a few days ago. It's actually also a really great world building project. I don't think there are books that are like, here's how you build a world. I think it's that you have to find stuff where people are doing amazing things and building their own worlds, and use that as inspiration. But don't make the mistake of thinking that you have to build your world in the same way that they do. When I talk with people about this, they a lot of times there's this impression that they have to be like J.R.R. Tolkien, and that they have to. That's what I thought. I thought I had to write this like vast back history and invent a all these languages and what I eventually came to realize was that Tolkien built his world in the way he knew best. Because he was an expert in languages. He was a linguist. He taught language. So that was, and he took his life experiences, in the trenches of World War I, and his passion for mythology and his disappointment in English, history, and that they didn't have a strong mythology like the Norse did and that the Greeks did. So he wanted to create his own mythology that would compete with those mythologies that he admired so much. And so that's why he built the world that he built. And so you have to look at your own life and your own passions and your own interests and frankly, and look at the things that you think are missing and out there, or that somebody hasn't done, or that you feel that you can do better. And that needs to be your inspiration for how you approach it. Not feeling like you have to do it like everyone else. And that's why when people invent their own fantasy worlds, oftentimes they end up looking just like, a knockoff of Middle Earth. And it's because people are approaching it the wrong way,
Yeah.
It's just another way of communicating your life experience, and your worldview, right? I mean, that's what world building is all about, and it's no different than any other form of storytelling.
Yeah, yeah. So like finding also your passion. So if I would like animals, and so I can create a world where all the animals can talk to humans or whatever it is, and just go
Right,
from there.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I used to think that that it was a problem that I didn't like to draw like superhero type characters with
Mm-hmm.
giant muscles and and all that stuff. I thought to myself, well, then I guess I'll never work in comics or anything like that, because I don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But but I realized that wasn't. I mean, that wasn't me. That wasn't the kind of thing that I wanted to draw and I was passionate about. And so what? Because there's plenty of people out there that do great stuff like that. Who's there's plenty of people that do better stuff along those lines than I would ever do because I'm not passionate about it. Um, there's this sort of balance. You don't want to pigeonhole yourself. You don't want to uh, you know um, take yourself out of an area where potentially you could have an influence visually, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
By avoiding certain things. But I guess what I'm saying is like I don't draw spaceships the way a lot of other people draw spaceships. I don't do like really slick surface design, reflective surface design stuff. That's not really what comes naturally to me. Doesn't mean I can't design my own spaceships, right? It's just that my spaceships are going to look different. They're going to be, I'm going to imagine spaceships that are built of different kinds of materials or are going to have a different aesthetic. And you know what? That may not be right for every project, but it'll be right for the right project, right? And I think that's what you have to realize is that yes, if you're doing stuff that's very personal, it's not going to get you every single job out there. But if it's something you're passionate about doing, that's going to reflect in the work, and people will either realize that what they want is something different and new and that they've never seen before, or somebody out there is looking for something very specific and they're not finding it, and then they happen upon your portfolio and they go, aha, this is it. A good example of that is I've done a lot of work for this company called Sideshow for their property, which is called Court of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot of these sort of sculpted collectible various scales. And it's about the underworld. It's about death and his cohorts and what the underworld is like, where the souls are ferried through from one world to the next. And it's pretty dark stuff. And my work can be dark, but it's always got this balance of sort of whimsy to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it never really dawned on me to even show my stuff to Sideshow for what they were doing, because I didn't think my stuff was dark enough, right? The art director for Sideshow came by my booth and he saw my work and he bought a bunch of my prints and my book, and he said, hey, I'd really like to work with you, and I'd like to have you on team, working on stuff for Court of the Dead, because I want to bring this flavor, this sort of whimsical approach
Mm-hmm.
to the world. I want to have a lot of different types of artists building this world, and not. I don't want it to just be one thing, and to be so myopic, right? And consequently, it's been one of the most fun clients I've had to work with. And one of the pieces I did for them just recently won an award for Spectrum. I got a gold award in Spectrum for concept art for a piece that I did for sideshows. So, that's the thing. You want to work for that kind of client that looks at your work and says, "I want you to do your thing with our material."
Yeah, because they also know what to expect, and they just really hire you for your work, so they don't
Right.
need you to do
Exactly.
something else.
Right. Yeah. If they're trying to tell you oh, we want you to work on this, but we want you to do it in this style that's like this other artist or whatever, I would be careful about, working on a project like that.
And what would be maybe your best advice about world building, if you can pick something like, okay, this is what I learned over the years?
Easy question. And the number one thing is, and this is sort of like a mantra that I developed. When I teach world building, it's one of my 5 or 6 mantras, and that is, in order to create compelling worlds, you have to have a passion for your own world, right? For our world, for the world around you. So being passionate about learning, being desiring to expand your knowledge base, going out to museums, going to cities and places you've never been before, reading books about subjects you have no clue about, right? In science, archaeology, biology, building a huge library of books on various things, as concept artists, as a world builder, you have to be multiple things. You have to be an archaeologist. You have to be an architect. You have to be a scientist. You have to be a biologist. You have to be a city planner. You have to be a merchant. There's just so, and it's like all of those things. You really become passionate about learning more about the world around you. The more inspiration you have, the more in that mental library that you have at your disposal. So it's important to not, sequester yourself in your own little world so much that you don't get out and really experience life. And because it's all of those things outside of your own little world are going to be part of the inspiration that adds to your mental visual library. You want to take your personal experiences and marry that with things that you're learning about the world around us. And that's what's going to make the material you create relatable and interesting, right? I learn about all kinds of interesting, like weird creatures that I never knew existed, and, cultures that I knew nothing about that have really fascinating, rituals or I go on Google Earth all the time, and I look at pictures from places I've never been and probably never will go, or it's very unlikely that I might go there, anytime soon. But there may be things that, that you didn't know were there. That these. Recently, a little while ago, I found in Spain there are these little interesting villages that all sort of have this similar architectural style, where they're built in these little round huts that have these very specific conical roofs on them. And it's just like, where did that come from? And why is it only in this like one section of Spain? And, so I'm saying, you never know where you're going to find inspiration. And so, but if you stay inside your house all day and you never bother to learn anything new or expand your knowledge base, you're not going to learn, you're not going to see these things. And I tell my students this all the time. Like, I force them to go to the library, and instead of using Google image search to find reference, because, if everybody just used any, what they find on the top of a Google image search, everything is going to look the same, right?
Yeah.
Books are an amazing resource, and they have reference in things in them that you will not find anywhere else. You won't find on the internet. Yeah. Or at least, you won't happen upon them in the same way that you do when you get a book on anthropology or a book on Japanese mythology or whatever, right?
Yeah, definitely. And one of my last questions is about the future. And if you imagine yourself in 5 to 10 years in your dream scenario, everything is how you want, what are you doing, and what's around you, and how everything looks?
Lounging on the deck of a giant golden yacht in the Pacific Ocean. I'm just kidding. um, I don't know. That's I you know, my fantasy, my dream has always been, ever since I first started thinking about Gateway, I've always seen it in my head as a film, as a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, so, I mean, 5 years, I hope that I've created more products, and to inspire people and to build my audience and to potentially get to the point where, the idea is less crazy of pitching this as a movie or as a TV series or as a video game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, um, I have a family, and so I have a lot, I have that part of me as well, where I want to have, a rich and full family life, and I want them to be comfortable and happy, because that makes me happy, but I also hope that I'm continuing to teach and to inspire people, and that in 5 years, I hope that if I could see what the kind of work I'm doing in 5 years, then I'd be amazed at myself, and think I never thought I'd be able to do that, and I think everybody should be shooting for that kind of goal. Like, I told my students in an illustration class I'm teaching, they're doing a mythology course, or a mythology project rather,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I told them I want them to their goal for this piece for it to be the best version of that mythological character that's ever been created.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that should be everyone's goal when they're setting out to do something. If it's something they're passionate about, they should want to be able to make it something that no one's ever seen before in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in I was kind of happy about moving to Florida was that what I don't want to see myself doing in 5 years is shoveling 3 feet of snow in January, February, and March, which sometimes is the case when you're up in New York.
Yep.
So, but but that doesn't. But at the same time, like there's, I would like to be able to travel more too. I mean, I want to be in a place where I'm traveling and being inspired by the world around me. My family, were planning on going to Spain this summer and spend a month there. I'd like to do that every summer. To be able to spend at least a month in a new place that I've never been. Maybe the year after it's Poland. With some amazing cities there. But what I want to do is I want to go and I want to draw. And I want to be inspired by these places and not just, have to rely on looking at them in Google Earth, But I do travel, and I've traveled to probably a lot, a lot more places than most people, and then sometimes I've gotten to do it for a job, and so I want to continue to do that and just be inspired by the world.
And if you think about like really far future, what about like 100 years from now? What would you like to be remembered for?
I mean, to be honest, a gateway. I mean, I want it to be something that people are continuing to enjoy and are making their own stories, and creating their own corners of Gateway. I've always seen Gateway as a collaborative project. I've always seen it as something that is a canvas for other people to play around in. And I think when you're building a world, that really should be everyone's goal. It doesn't make sense to control it so tightly, because then it will never have the ability to breathe and feel like a real place. So yeah, I mean, I think that's my main goal. I think, for what my legacy is. I don't know. I don't know about you. I plan on still being around in 100 years.
Good. Yeah, some robotic legs, arm, spaceships.
Exactly.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Well, it might be possible. 140, 41. It's not that impossible. I think.
That's true. But then gateway will be already established, you know, and it might be the world we live in. You never know.
Right. Who knows? Who knows?
And before we say goodbye, maybe you can share like last piece of advice or key takeaway, and then we will slowly finish.
Yeah. I don't know. I think the takeaway is trust your own vision, trust your own ideas, right? I mean, no one. And this is what I'll say. A lot of people they'll come to me and they'll say, "Oh, have you seen this other world or this story? It's just like Gateway, or it reminds me very much of Gateway. Aren't you upset? You know, like are you worried that this thing is too much like Gateway?" And my answer is almost always no. In fact, it always is no, because what I realized was I don't need to worry about someone else's property or world or ideas or stories. Even if they're similar, no one can create Gateway the way I can, as long as I'm being honest about it, right? As long as it's coming from an honest place. And so I think that's the key takeaway, is be honest with yourself and create work that comes from an honest place. You know, if you're trying to make a portfolio or trying to make a piece because you want it to look just like this other artist, because you think that's what will get you work, or that's what's gonna make you a famous artist, is if you can be just like, you know, so and so. I don't think that's being honest with yourself. You know, I think the goal should be to be yourself. You know, and that's very cliche, but I you know, the more I do this work, the more true I realize that is.
Yeah, amazing. I really agree. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights. It was so much fun.
Yeah, you bet. No, this was fun.
So thanks again, and thank you everyone for joining, and see you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and let me know in comments. Also, please subscribe to my channel for more videos, because I post new interview every single workday. You can also find the resources mentioned in this episode at artsideoflife.com. Just type a guest name in the search bar. There is also a little freebie waiting for you, so go check it out. If you want to listen to the interviews on the go, make sure to check out the podcast episodes at artsideoflife.com/podcast. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you, and don't forget to inspire each other. I will see you guys in the next episode.